The tension in the courtroom was palpable the moment President Trump's legal team entered, the kind of pressure that could almost be felt through the screen as cameras rolled and journalists leaned forward, pens poised, knowing they were about to witness a confrontation with ramifications far beyond the gavel. From the very first seconds, the stakes were clear. This was not just a legal proceeding. This was a test of strategy, influence, and the limits of public perception. And as the judge called the room to order, the atmosphere thickened, a heavy mix of anticipation and dread hanging over every participant as lawyers shuffled papers, whispered last-minute instructions, and prepared to navigate a gauntlet where one misstep could be recorded, dissected, and broadcast to millions in real time. The opening statement set the tone, sharp and measured, yet every word seemed to carry the weight of expectation, every pause amplified by the silent judgment of observers who understood that in high-profile cases, body language often speaks louder than rhetoric. Witnesses fidgeted, legal assistants exchanged subtle cues, and the president's team projected confidence that belied the underlying tension. Aware that a single faltering argument could create ripples that would be felt in public discourse, social media, and the narrative framing of the trial itself, making every motion, objection, and response a potential flashpoint for scrutiny and commentary. As the proceedings unfolded, it became clear that the courtroom was a battlefield of intellect and preparation, where every line of questioning tested not only legal acumen, but the psychological resilience of all involved. Lawyers navigated a complex web of precedent, evidentiary rules, and strategic positioning, carefully anticipating counterpoints while projecting authority, and analysts watching from outside noted subtle shifts in posture, glances exchanged, and micro-reactions that suggested cracks or confidence, revealing that even in the most controlled legal environment, instinct, experience, and human emotion play a critical role in outcomes that the public will later interpret as triumph or humiliation. The judge's demeanor added another layer of drama, measured and deliberate, signaling attention to procedural fairness while exuding a quiet authority that underscored the gravity of each ruling. Objections were sustained and overruled with precise timing, motions dissected with surgical attention, and every decision carried implicit commentary on the strength or weakness of arguments presented, creating a rhythm of tension that kept the audience on edge, as if each ruling were a plot twist in a drama where stakes were simultaneously legal, personal, and symbolic, shaping the trajectory of the case and the reputation of those in the spotlight. Outside the courtroom, media outlets worked frantically to translate dense legal procedures into narratives that could capture the public imagination, emphasizing the elements that dramatize the moment while still conveying factual developments, and in doing so, magnified the sense of humiliation associated with any setback. Every headline, live update, and social media thread transformed the courtroom into a stage where perception became almost as important as the law itself, creating a feedback loop in which public reaction influenced the atmosphere in real time, affecting morale, narrative framing, and the pressure on legal teams to perform flawlessly under a microscope of unprecedented attention. Behind the scenes, extensive preparation had gone into anticipating every possible development, from cross-examinations to evidence challenges and the orchestration of witness testimony, yet even the most meticulously crafted strategy encountered the unpredictability of human behavior, including the instinctive reactions of opposing counsel, judicial interpretations, and subtle psychological shifts. Every glance, hesitated word, or sigh became part of a broader tapestry of tension, creating a dynamic interplay between law, performance, and perception, where the stakes were amplified by the knowledge that millions were watching, dissecting, and forming opinions instantaneously. By the close of the first session, the narrative of a humiliating setback began to crystallize. Technical errors, procedural missteps, and strategic oversights combined to shape a ruling that, while precise and legally grounded, carried symbolic weight that extended far beyond the courtroom. Commentators immediately highlighted the implications, dissecting not only what the court decided, but how the decision reflected on Trump's strategy, credibility, and influence, demonstrating that in high-profile cases, outcomes are simultaneously matters of law, optics, and narrative control, leaving the audience riveted and eager for every subsequent development. As the second session unfolded, the courtroom's tension deepened, each side probing weaknesses and attempting to seize psychological advantage, and it became clear that the proceedings were not just about law, but a high-stakes contest of influence and narrative control, where every objection and motion carried both procedural weight and symbolic meaning, and even minor concessions were magnified under the intense scrutiny of cameras, analysts, and a public eager for drama, making every gesture, pause, and inflection critical. The audience outside the courtroom could almost feel the pressure as attorneys balanced strategy with perception, understanding that a single misstep could define the story in the court of public opinion. Witness testimonies added another layer of suspense, revealing contradictions, reinforcing allegations, and sometimes offering fleeting moments of vindication for one side or humiliation for the other, as lawyers carefully guided each line of questioning to maximize evidentiary impact while minimizing exposure to cross-examination. Each answer was dissected in real time by media analysts, legal experts, and social media commentators, turning the courtroom into a dynamic narrative battlefield where every word contributed to the unfolding story of triumph, setback, and public perception, creating a sense of immediacy that gripped viewers from the first sentence. The subtle interplay of confidence and doubt became increasingly visible in body language, posture, and micro-expressions, with the president's legal team projecting authority even as strategic vulnerabilities emerged under intense judicial scrutiny. Conversely, opposing counsel capitalized on these moments, exploiting hesitations and misstatements to strengthen their position, and the audience could sense the psychological tension that underpinned each exchange, revealing that in high-profile trials, law and human behavior are inseparable, with instinct, experience, and emotional intelligence playing roles as significant as technical legal knowledge. Throughout the session, the judge maintained a commanding presence, interjecting with pointed questions, clarifying procedural nuances, and delivering subtle reminders of evidentiary standards, all of which amplified the stakes and heightened the perception of a humiliating setback for the president. The measured yet firm guidance underscored the independence of the judiciary and the gravity of each ruling, reminding observers that outcomes were determined not by reputation or influence, but by legal reasoning, attention to detail, and adherence to precedent, a fact that resonated with both legal professionals and a public attuned to spectacle and narrative. Media coverage outside the courtroom intensified, translating legal complexity into digestible headlines that highlighted drama, tension, and perceived failure, while social media amplified every nuance, creating a parallel narrative where the symbolic weight of the loss loomed as large as the procedural facts. Memes, commentary, and opinion threads exploded within minutes, shaping public perception and framing the hearing as a pivotal moment of accountability, strategy, and national attention, further increasing pressure on all involved to perform flawlessly and maintain composure under unprecedented observation. Behind-the-scenes strategy meetings revealed the exhaustive preparation required to navigate the second day of hearings, including scenario planning for unexpected rulings, calibration of witness statements, and the fine-tuning of argument sequencing. The legal team monitored shifts in momentum carefully, recalibrating tactics in response to each judicial cue and procedural outcome, aware that even subtle errors could be magnified and portrayed as humiliation, while successes could provide rare moments of leverage to influence perception, media coverage, and future legal strategy. By the end of the session, the emerging narrative was unmistakable. Technical missteps and judicial rulings combined to deliver a setback that, while grounded in law, carried symbolic weight far beyond the courtroom. Observers and commentators immediately began analyzing the implications for public perception, political influence, and narrative control, emphasizing that in cases of this magnitude, the line between procedural outcome and public spectacle blurs, and the story of a humiliating loss becomes as much about optics, psychology, and strategy as about law itself, leaving audiences riveted and anxiously anticipating the next chapter in a trial that continues to captivate the nation. The third day of hearings opened with a palpable sense of anticipation, every participant acutely aware that the courtroom was no longer merely a venue for legal argument, but a stage where reputation, strategy, and public perception intersected. And from the first moment the gavel struck, the tension was almost unbearable. Cameras flashed, legal teams whispered last-minute adjustments, and observers leaned forward, knowing that the slightest misstep, hesitation, or misstatement could immediately dominate headlines and social media feeds, turning a procedural detail into a national spectacle and magnifying the narrative of humiliation that had already begun to take hold. Witness testimony intensified the scrutiny, with each answer dissected not only for factual content, but for its potential to reinforce or undermine broader strategic positions. Attorneys navigated the line between extracting admissions and maintaining credibility, aware that the courtroom itself had become a psychological arena where every expression, pause, and vocal inflection carried weight beyond the legal record. and where the interplay between instinct, experience, and tactical calculation determined who would appear composed and who would appear vulnerable under the relentless public eye. The president's team faced mounting pressure as opposing counsel delivered incisive questioning, exposing vulnerabilities in argumentation and highlighting gaps in strategy. The judge, impartial yet keenly attentive, occasionally interjected with pointed clarifications that underscored procedural precision, further signaling that the outcome rested on adherence to law rather than public persona, and the cumulative effect of these rulings began to solidify the narrative of a humiliating setback, a moment that was as much psychological as it was legal, leaving both the courtroom and the wider public in a state of high-tension observation. Observers noted the subtle but significant shifts in demeanor among key players, with body language revealing rising frustration, calculated restraint, or fleeting moments of triumph. The courtroom became a theater of micro-expressions, where the slightest twitch, glance, or sigh could signal confidence, doubt, or internal recalibration. And analysts dissected these cues in real time, connecting them to broader questions about strategic competence, credibility, and the psychological impact of sustained scrutiny, revealing that high-profile legal battles are as much about managing perception as they are about presenting argument. Media coverage magnified every nuance, translating complex procedural developments into narratives that the public could quickly grasp, emphasizing the tension, drama, and symbolic consequences of each ruling, and creating a feedback loop in which courtroom developments influenced public opinion, which in turn affected the interpretation of subsequent moves. Social media amplified every moment, from a judge's raised eyebrow to a lawyer's hesitant phrasing, transforming legal procedure into a story of suspense, humiliation, and stakes that extended far beyond the courtroom walls. Behind-the-scenes strategy meetings were relentless, with legal teams recalibrating arguments, reviewing evidence, and preparing for potential pivots based on how the judge responded to testimony and motions. Attention to detail became critical, as even minor missteps could be portrayed as evidence of incompetence or overreach, reinforcing the narrative of a humiliating loss. And the combination of legal complexity, human psychology, and media amplification created an environment where every decision had consequences for both the outcome of the case and its perception in the broader public sphere. By the conclusion of the third day, the narrative arc had become increasingly clear. The cumulative effect of rulings, procedural challenges, and strategic missteps had solidified a perception of humiliation, amplified by public scrutiny and media framing. What began as a technical legal proceeding had evolved into a high-profile drama where the convergence of law, psychology, and narrative control created a story that captivated the nation, compelling viewers to follow, comment, and engage while reminding all involved that in such high-stakes cases, perception and reality are intertwined, and the courtroom is simultaneously a place of law, theater, and spectacle. As the fourth day unfolded, the courtroom atmosphere grew almost unbearable, a tension so thick it seemed to press down on every observer and participant alike, because now the implications of prior rulings had begun to crystallize, and every word, glance, and objection could tip the balance of perception between authority and humiliation. Cameras rolled relentlessly, capturing every nuance while the legal teams moved with precise choreography, aware that the slightest misstep could be amplified into a symbolic defeat, a narrative that could overshadow even the procedural substance of the trial. Witnesses returned to testify with heightened scrutiny, their every answer dissected not only by the lawyers present, but by a nation watching in real time, where analysis flowed immediately across media outlets, social platforms, and opinion forums. Each hesitated word, each moment of uncertainty became fodder for debate and speculation, emphasizing that in a case of this magnitude, the courtroom was not merely a legal arena, but a stage where perception, psychology, and strategic presentation were as consequential as the law itself. The president's team faced intense pressure as opposing counsel exploited every opportunity to highlight inconsistencies, procedural gaps, or potential miscalculations. Their every move calculated to amplify the narrative of humiliation, while the judge, calm yet authoritative, underscored the importance of adherence to precedent and evidentiary rules, reinforcing that the ultimate verdict would rest on meticulous legal reasoning rather than public perception, even as the public narrative increasingly framed the proceedings as a dramatic setback for Trump. Throughout the session, micro-expressions and body language told a story as vivid as the words spoken. A frustration flickered across faces, moments of calculated composure alternated with fleeting hints of doubt, and observers both in the courtroom and across screens sensed the psychological tension at play, a dynamic interplay of instinct, preparation, and real-time decision-making, highlighting that high-profile trials are as much a test of mental fortitude as of legal strategy, and that every participant was acutely aware that symbolic defeat could resonate far beyond the gavel. Media outlets amplified every nuance, turning legal procedure into compelling drama, headlines, live updates, and social media threads, translated complex rulings into digestible narratives, emphasizing the symbolic humiliation and high stakes, and creating a feedback loop where public perception influenced commentary and further heightened the pressure on all involved. The courtroom was transformed into both theater and battlefield, where perception and law intersected, and each procedural detail had ramifications for credibility, strategy, and public narrative. Behind the scenes, legal teams engaged in continuous recalibration, reviewing prior rulings, refining arguments, and preparing contingencies for unforeseen developments, aware that each adjustment could mitigate or exacerbate the perception of a humiliating loss. The meticulous attention to evidence, cross-examination, and timing reflected not only legal acumen, but an understanding of the symbolic stakes, and underscored that success in high-profile litigation requires mastery of both law and narrative, as procedural setbacks quickly become stories of public perception and psychological consequence. By the end of the fourth session, the narrative of humiliation had been further entrenched. Strategic missteps, judicial rulings, and procedural outcomes combined to create a story of symbolic setback, amplified by media coverage and social discourse, reinforcing the perception that even figures of immense influence are not immune to defeat under scrutiny, and leaving the audience captivated, analyzing every detail and anticipating what would unfold next. Because in this convergence of law, psychology, and spectacle, the stakes extend far beyond the courtroom walls, shaping public perception, political discourse, and the narrative of power itself. The fifth day of hearings opened with an almost tangible electricity in the air, as if the courtroom itself understood the gravity of the moment. Every participant acutely aware that the momentum of the prior sessions had set a narrative that now seemed unstoppable. And from the very first gavel strike, the pressure was suffocating. Legal teams whispered last-minute instructions, observers leaned forward in tense anticipation, and journalists prepared to capture each micro-expression, because this was more than law. It was spectacle, psychology, and reputation, all intertwined in a drama watched by millions. Witnesses took the stand under an intensity that few could withstand, their answers dissected in real time by lawyers, pundits, and social media commentators alike, magnifying the symbolic weight of every detail. Hesitation, emphasis, and phrasing were scrutinized, and even small inconsistencies became ammunition for opposing counsel, feeding the perception of strategic missteps and adding to the growing narrative of humiliation that had begun to define the proceedings, demonstrating that in cases of this magnitude, courtroom dynamics extend far beyond procedural arguments. The president's legal team moved with careful precision, but cracks began to show under the relentless pressure, subtle shifts in posture, fleeting facial expressions, and micro-pauses betraying the tension that no amount of preparation could fully eliminate. Every motion, objection, and line of questioning became a delicate balancing act where the law intersected with psychology, media scrutiny, and the ever-present narrative of public perception, making the courtroom a theater where legal skill and emotional endurance were tested simultaneously. The judge's pronouncements, calm and deliberate, further cemented the procedural reality of a setback, emphasizing evidentiary standards, procedural requirements, and legal reasoning in a manner that left little room for misinterpretation. Yet the symbolic implications were impossible to ignore, as observers immediately translated rulings into narratives of triumph and humiliation, while commentators dissected the nuances, signaling to the world that even the most powerful figures are subject to accountability under law, and that symbolic weight often exceeds the strictly procedural consequences of a court decision. Media coverage exploded with intensity, amplifying every nuance, every subtle gesture, and every moment of tension into a story of national consequence, framing the narrative as one of humiliation, strategy, and high-stakes drama. Social media, blogs, and news outlets dissected each ruling moment and micro-expression, creating a feedback loop where public perception influenced commentary, which in turn intensified scrutiny within the courtroom, demonstrating the interplay of law, media, and psychology in shaping a story that captivates millions. Behind the scenes, the legal teams recalibrated with near-military precision, reviewing previous rulings, analyzing witness responses, and adjusting strategies in real time. cognizant that every move could either mitigate or exacerbate the narrative of a humiliating loss. Meticulous attention to detail, timing, and argument sequencing was paramount, highlighting that in high-profile trials, mastery of both substance and narrative is required because perception can be as consequential as the law itself, and a single oversight can shift momentum irreversibly. By the close of the fifth day, the courtroom drama had evolved into a multi-layered narrative of humiliation, strategy, and high-profile consequence where legal outcomes intersected with psychology, media amplification, and public perception to create a story with far-reaching implications. Observers were captivated, analysts dissected every detail, and the symbolic narrative of a setback for Trump had taken firm root, demonstrating that in cases where law and spectacle intersect, the stakes extend far beyond the gavel, shaping public discourse, political narratives, and the very perception of power itself. The sixth day of proceedings opened with a courtroom that felt charged with history itself. Every participant acutely aware that the momentum built over the prior sessions would culminate in outcomes that could shape public perception, influence political narrative, and define reputations for years to come. From the first gavel strike, tension hung in the air like a physical weight, and every word, gesture, and expression was magnified, not just by the media in the room, but by millions watching live and online, waiting to witness whether strategy, preparation, and human instinct could withstand scrutiny at the highest level. Witnesses returned under the relentless spotlight of cross-examination, their every answer dissected by lawyers, court reporters, and a global audience, transforming testimony into both evidence and narrative. Hesitation, emphasis, and phrasing were immediately analyzed, feeding the story of a humiliating setback, and the courtroom itself became a theater of micro-expressions, instinctive reactions, and strategic calculations, where even a subtle twitch or raised eyebrow carried symbolic weight far beyond its immediate legal relevance. Trump's legal team, despite exhaustive preparation, faced mounting challenges as opposing counsel pressed with relentless precision, exposing weaknesses in arguments and highlighting gaps in strategy. Every objection, motion, and rhetorical flourish was scrutinized for its efficacy and optics, and the cumulative effect of prior procedural setbacks became increasingly visible, signaling to all present that perception, symbolism, and legal reality were now intertwined in a story of profound consequence, leaving no room for error or miscalculation. The judge's rulings, deliberate and authoritative, reinforced procedural rigor while implicitly highlighting vulnerabilities in strategy, creating a tension between technical legal outcomes and the symbolic narrative that was already dominating public discourse. Each pronouncement was dissected by media analysts and commentators in real time, emphasizing how law, psychology, and perception converge, and demonstrating that even carefully executed strategy can be reframed by courtroom dynamics and the relentless scrutiny of both press and public. Media coverage and social amplification escalated dramatically, converting procedural nuances into a gripping, widely followed drama. Every ruling, gesture, and reaction became part of a national story, with headlines, social media threads, and news analysis framing the proceedings as a sequence of humiliations and setbacks, and creating a feedback loop in which public perception influenced further scrutiny, commentary, and narrative emphasis, amplifying the impact of each legal decision, far beyond the walls of the courthouse. Behind the scenes, legal teams engaged in meticulous recalibration, reviewing prior testimony, evaluating tactical adjustments, and anticipating potential rulings, all under the knowledge that symbolic losses could eclipse procedural victories. Attention to timing, argument sequencing, and evidentiary precision was paramount, highlighting that mastery of both legal substance and narrative perception is essential in high-profile trials, where human behavior, strategy, and media amplification converge to shape a story that resonates nationally and even globally. By the conclusion of the sixth day, the narrative of humiliation had solidified, a cumulative story shaped by procedural outcomes, judicial scrutiny, strategic missteps, and media amplification, creating a compelling tale that extended far beyond law into the realm of public perception, psychological drama, and political narrative. Viewers were left riveted, commentators dissected every nuance, and the story of a humiliating loss became a powerful reminder that even the most powerful figures are subject to scrutiny, consequence, and the inexorable influence of perception, leaving a nation both captivated and engaged in a trial that had transformed from legal process into cultural spectacle.